spoke, which feels like years ago, we were talking about the Holocaust and specifically when we learned about it. Most of us, it was around middle school, coincided with what was in our social studies textbooks, or many of us, like myself, went to the Holocaust Museum, which was horrifying. But we also discussed how there's just some gaps in our learning. There, we understand what the Holocaust is. We feel that we know it because we learned about it. But when we really look at the details, we're like, actually, there's some major gaps there. We are culturally pretty obsessed with World War II and the Holocaust, and there's a lot of theories about why that is. But you can even just look at just how cinematic it is, how many films are about World War II or about the Holocaust. It is a really captivating narrative, and it was just such a bonkers war, um, on this incredible world stage that affected the U.S. tremendously. Um, but because we see these images, because we spend time learning about it, because we go to a museum, it's easy for us to think that we do understand it. But we're also getting it from a really specific perspective. It's always from an allied perspective. It's usually just focused on what's going on in Germany. I didn't realize that I didn't know the timeline of the war in any country other than like Germany and the U.S. And in England, and then not even until a couple of years ago did I really look at what was going on in the Pacific Rim. But when it comes to Poland, which is where Mouse takes place, I didn't learn about any of that stuff until I studied it on my own. And so, similar with Persepolis, we do have this responsibility to fill in the gaps in our own education. Because even though this is a class in diverse literature, we do talk about history quite a bit for a diverse literature course. We can also think of it as a class in diverse history, where in diverse literature, we want to give space to voices, or in our case, genres, that are not normally paid attention to. And we can also do that with history. We don't have any reason to learn about the Islamic Revolution with Persepolis. We don't have any reason really to go into a detailed timeline of Poland. We're given a general timeline of the place that makes sense, which is Germany, and we kind of leave it at that. But that's where so much of those nuances pop up. And so today we're going to have just sort of a general lecture. It will not be this long in the future, on the history of Jews in Poland, because we do need to treat this text differently than we did Persepolis. Yeah, we looked at the history a lot. It was important, but we could just look at Persepolis as a very character-forward approach. It was a Bildungsroman. We could erase all of those elements of culture, of the war around her, and it wouldn't be as good, but we would still have a story. But here, history really plays the main character. You can see it even in the title of this first section, My Father Bleeds History. It's impossible for us to not have a history forward view into Mouse. And so this will be our longest little preparation and foundation for our text of the history of the Jews in Poland. This is the part that people don't know as much of really how did this develop. We can say, oh, well, World War I was really hard on Germany, and we can understand why Hitler rose to power. But when it comes to yes, but how did this trap these different Eastern European countries? How did they exactly fall, and what happened to those people? Because a lot of things that happened in Mouse are Poland specific. Some of them, like the concentration camps, we're a little more familiar with those narratives. A lot of the movies take place, or the museums focus on Auschwitz and Birkenau. And so there's something a little bit more familiar with that. But when it comes to actually how this developed, we're a little bit more lost. And so this isn't like the exciting part, but I think that we owe it to this history, this diverse history, to make space for it. Yes, we're going back to the early days. This map is actually from 1500, but you can't tell the difference. So Poland has always been an incredibly important place for Jews, something that people don't recognize. Within sort of middle, 1400, 1500, 1600, 3/4 of the world's population of Jews were in Poland alone, what ended up being Poland's borders now. And it was part of a commonwealth, so the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, similar to what England and New Zealand and Australia have, kind of just this little club that's protective. And that really helped for a little while, because Poland was an incredibly religiously tolerant place, which is why Jews were able to live there and be successful there. We can trace anti-Semitism back to the Bible, but this was a little bit of a paradise. There's actually something that a lot of historians have a, what do they do? I think there's a phrase I'm looking for now because I wrote it down because I don't know this part in Latin, but they have a literal phrase for this time period. And now I don't know where it is. Oh well, it's Paradiso. Was it Eudorium? It literally doesn't matter. Anyways, it was a paradise of the Jews, and this wasn't really challenged until the 1600s. And so 1600s we know was an important time religiously, especially for those of us as Christians, because of the Protestant Reformation and then the Counter Reformation by the Catholics. So people were really focused on Germany at that time, but Poland had a lot of Catholics in it. Catholicism was really big in Poland at the time. And so this obviously caused a lot of discord within Poland. And so, yeah, the Jews were on the outside of that. But I mean, all of Europe was just up in arms. It was horrible. It was violent. There was this us and them mentality. Then Jews were sort of just like in the crosshairs, but there was a greater focus on religion as part of your identity. And so that started to bleed more into Polish life, of viewing Jews not as Poles necessarily, because they like really seeing them for their religion, if not for the first time in a sharper relief. And it also led to the dissolving of the Commonwealth, which was kind of a bummer, because then all of these empires around here started eating it up, which I call the classic Eastern European story. So the Habsburg Empire, the Prussian Empire, Brandenburg Prussian Empire, and then the Russian Empire, which has always just been a massive beastie, just literally started to eat away at the borders. And I call this the classic Eastern European story because every Eastern European country has just sort of been these classic underdogs. And I'm going to say mainly because of Russia. I'm just going to put that out there. But I used to live part-time and spend a lot of time in Romania, and Romania is like a perfect little like example, a perfect little microcosm of this. You can't even see it on the map yet. It shows up later in like the 18 somethings because it existed, but it had lots of different names because different people owned it, and then they would just completely redo it. But it's really interesting because if you are out in the country in Romania, which is it's a sort of a peasant country, very provincial. It's gorgeous. If you go out there, there's like literally cows and haystacks and cows in the road, and it's really wonderful. So in the villages, you see a lot of traditional architecture. You could look at the architecture as this this sort of symbol of how the borders have ebbed and flowed. So in areas that have been untouched or just sort of forgotten because they're not in major, city areas, you see the sort of thatch roof houses. You see really defined architecture with those roofs, especially as you get up to like Moldova. But if you go into the very center, so Transylvania is a region in the very center, it was occupied by Austrian Empire and previously a German, whatever iteration the German Empire was in. And so basically when you're walking through, for example, the streets of Cebu, which is the major city in the very center of Transylvania, it's like you are in Vienna. It does not look Romanian at all. Even like the coloring of this building, these minty colors, like that's so wonderfully German, and these yellows. And there's still many Germans who live there. And it's interesting. I love this city. And there's like a bunch of Lutheran churches around. There is, of course, an Orthodox church, but there's more of a presence of Protestantism, which is super, super interesting. But if you go over into the western side, which this is Timișoara, where I used to spend a lot of time, it was part of the the Hungarian Empire for a while, and part of Hungary for a while. And so you see a lot of that same architecture in here as well. If you go over to the eastern side, the Turkish Empire was like the big baddie that was just eating away at that side of Romania. And so you can still see a lot of Turkish architecture, except most of it was destroyed during the Cold War. Anyway, actually, I'm going to go back to one thing, because I didn't want to get here yet. Don't worry, we will return. Okay, so Russia basically just like chomped this up. And what does that mean for the Jews that live there? It's not like they were exterminated. We're not quite there yet. But there were so many restrictions. And so this place that was previously so tolerant of different religions started to try to control their control the Jewish population, which is a lot of people. They were super, super harsh. They demanded assimilation. They didn't want people to have their own identity. And a big way that they did that was by banning Yiddish and teaching Yiddish. And we know that languages, once you strip a language away from people, you're really disarming them of their identity, of their shared identity. And there are lots of other horrible things too. One of the worst ones was they would demand soldiers from Jewish families, so like boys, instead of them being 18 years old, like a soldier normally would be, even like Russian families, the soldiers from their families would be 18. They wanted 12-year-olds. And so a lot of people ended up sort of trying to smuggle their children like back into areas either in the Austrian Empire or the Prussian Empire. And then eventually there started to be a little bit of a weird Poland shaping thing here that trying to get them out of there. It was a dangerous place to be. Lots of social limitation. This is where ghettos really first popped up in the form of, yes, we're going to go back, shtetls. So if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, the movie or the musical, the whole thing exists in this shtetl, this little village. Everyone knows each other, very provincial, but they it's a nice little like community, but they're always very run down because they were restricted to these areas. So Russia would restrict people, Jews, to live in this one area called the Pale of Settlement. And I didn't put it on the right area. I just sort of wrote it down. But they were not allowed to live in big major cities, but they did have to live in cities. There was this push to get Jews into cities, which you see even once Poland, because it becomes its own country, and once we're looking at Maus, 77% of Jews within Poland during World War II were in cities, and that was still kind of a holdover from a lot of these demands from Russia. And just to show some changes, we have a change from the Austrian Empire to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So people are changing. There's Romania finally. And then 1881 is an important date. 1881 was really the mega turning point, one of the mega turning points, because that's when Tsar Nicholas II was, or sorry, excuse me, Tsar Alexander II, was assassinated. And a lot of people blamed that on the Jews, which didn't totally make sense because it was definitely Russians from a radical group that murdered him. But that just started all of this suspicion that sort of spread even into newly formed areas of Poland. And that's where we started getting pogroms. So pogroms come up in Maus. So the first time, I'll come back to that one. The first time we see it, oh no, I didn't link it up. What a bummer. Hold on, this is just like class. There it is. I found it. We see them when they're going to Czechoslovakia to take Anja to the sanitarium. Like, oh, there's a pogrom going on in Germany today. So that's what he's referencing. So a pogrom is a riot that is based, a very, very violent massacre, riot based off of ethnic or religious heritage. And so even though that's the definition, pogroms are really just for Jews. Almost all of them were targeting Jewish groups. And the difference between something like this and something like the Holocaust is that this isn't normally organized in the same way. So the really, really big one, the one that happened directly after, is it going to do it? Yep. After the Tsar was assassinated was the Warsaw pogrom, and that was in 1881, and it was a direct result of that. And there were these guys that spread a rumor that there was this fire at a church on Christmas Day, and it ended up being a false warning, but everybody freaked out, and then 29 people were stamped. It was stampede. Stamped to death? That doesn't sound right. So 29 of them died, and then after that, 26,000 were arrested. They thought that the 5 people who had warned of the fire were pickpockets and just using this moment of chaos to pickpocket from people. And there was this assumption that they must be Jews, because already people are doubting that Jews are really loyal to whatever nation they're a part of, that they're loyal to their faith, but they're not, and to each other, but they're not loyal to the rest of the state. And that definitely held over. But 2 people ended up being killed, 2 of those who were arrested, who were actually innocent. And this just financially devastated Jewish businesses, and it drove a massive wedge in the relations of Jews with Poles. Keep in mind, these are usually Poles that are doing this to Jews, and Russians also would do to Jews. But this led to a mass immigration. So in 1881 was one of the larger years for immigration of Jews from Poland to America. And one of those includes my great-great-grandparents. So that's my great-great-grandpa. I don't know what his Polish name is, or what his Jewish maiden name was, because he never like shared it, but he went by Michael, and his wife Francisca, and his last name is Ryba, and that is my great grandma. She looks terrifying, and this, I forget her name, but she looks like a tiny demon. Anyways, they left because of the pogroms, and pretty sure that if they stayed, would not have ended well for them, because Warsaw was the worst place. It was absolutely decimated of Jews. So a bunch of wars started to break out once we got into the 1900s after the First World War, which I'm not even going to spend time on because that's just too much. There were just a bunch of different like little civil wars. There's the Austria-Hungarians, and then the German Empire were fighting over Poland, and then eventually Poland went to war with Russia, and this is really where a lot of those bad seeds were sowed that started some of the major anti-Semitism within Poland in the 20th century. But eventually we got to an interwar period. Similar to our interwar period in the 1920s, it was thankfully a little bit of a relief. That is when the USSR popped up, though, so that was kind of a hot bummer. But this does help contextualize. No, I didn't link up to that one either. Oh, you fool, Taylor. This helps contextualize what happened with Anja and the documents, the communist documents. So we only get a little glimpse of some of this tension here, but there was a huge worry after the war with Poland and Russia that there were Russian spies within Poland, and Poland's kind of like this new country with its own borders again, and they were pretty stoked. And so anybody who had any kind of connection with Russia, which by the way is tough because for a while Jews were under mega regulation when Poland was still a part of Russia. So there's a lot of just sort of muddying the waters of what kind of nationality are you, because it's sort of changing generation to generation based off of who's in charge of you. 1933 is when we see the rise of the Third Reich, which is in black appropriately, and we see it kind of creeping in, but Poland hasn't been affected. Poland is actually in a pretty good period right now. Even though there's this stuff looming over here, it isn't directly affecting Poland. In fact, Poland is doing pretty great. It's a peaceful time. It's a prosperous time, specifically for Jews. People were very happy. There's a lot of economic mobility. People were free to express their Jewish heritage. There wasn't a whole lot of demonstrations or things like that. It was a really productive time. I just wanted to include this because it had a dog on a little donkey who's riding it. It's great. And I just like that horse. Okay. It was also a really good time to invest in businesses. So there were tons and tons of Jewish families that owned shops. And we see that connected with our reading because the families both, Vladek has his own business for a little while, but the family he marries into, Anja's family, they are very, very wealthy, and they made a lot of money through manufacturing, through, owning stores. A lot of it was textiles. You see people who have shoe businesses, dress businesses, and what's super interesting is that carries over into the U.S. as well. So many of our department stores, the whole culture of department stores came from Jews. Jews running Gimbel's and Neiman Marcus, Bloomingdale's, Bergdorf's, Levi Strauss and Sears were originally not Jews, but their partner was, even if they didn't have the name on there. So a lot of these have shut down. Of course, department stores have shut down, but in their heyday in the 1800s through to the 60s, you saw a lot of Jewish-owned department stores. I just have a couple pictures of shops. I don't think that one's actually in. That one's in Poland for sure. But even here you can see, I think this one is a little bit later than I thought because you can see the Star of David's on there. And we do see this. The Alberg family has a lot of money. We have an image of Jews during World War II being really, really poor, but a lot of it was this incredible downward mobility of these imposed laws. Of eventually, when we get to the end of chapter 3, we see like, oh my gosh, they are literally have like food tickets, a lot of like tickets to get food. And they're just being really, really, really regulated. And so attacking those businesses is really how you got Jews into a precarious financial situation where you get that image from them. Oh man, this one didn't link up too. I think we'll take a break there. And then I'm going to come back to this one so that you're not watching just like an hour of me talking. So, okay.